let's do this. All right. So yeah. So happy to sort of answer any questions. Does anyone have any kind of questions to get us started? Think Vikas messaged me one. Um so the question was, are we going to have anything other than the two essays in the final? No. That will be the exam. And for like word and page requirements, uh, you have an hour and 45 minutes for the exam. Just make sure to use it all effectively. And so write as much as you can. I previously said sort of 2 pages front and back for of the blue books for the second term essay, and then approaching like 3 pages front and back for the longer essay. And I expect them to be a little bit longer because you guys don't have any IDs to do. And you have to cover a lot more sort of material in that second essay. But again, I want to really emphasize using the full time. There were a number of people who, you know, lost probably like um 8, 9% on their midterms simply because they didn't write enough. They didn't fully answer the questions, right? So you use that time. Because again, I think in the midterms, sometimes some people turned in the midterms like 40 minutes. I mean, before the end of the midterm itself. So it's, you know, you're meant to be writing the entire time. And if you do so, I think you'll do really well in the exam. So, yeah. All right. So yeah, so what other questions do people have? Do we want to go over any of the specific questions on the study guide? Do you have any sort of specific detailed questions about any of those prompts? I'm kind of we can kind of start with whatever we want here.
Yeah, can we go over one of like the synthesis essay questions? It
Oh,
doesn't matter which one,
oops.
just
I
like
just realized I didn't have my volume up. So sorry about that. Go ahead, James. My bad.
you're good. Yeah, can we just go over like one of the synthesis essay questions? Either one, it doesn't matter. Just kind of like expectations and
Sure.
kind of like some good things to draw from or specific things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that'd be fine. Yeah, so let's just take a look at the first one. Um, so the first one is on democracy, and it talks about how democracy was significantly expanded by the latter part of the 20th century, from the end of the Civil War. And so right there, that sort of first sentence gives you the scope of the question, right? We're talking from the end of the Civil War to the present day, roughly, is the scope of the question. Um, so that's kind of what you're working with. And then we get a little bit more detailed question here. How were democracy and civil rights expanded from only white men in 1865 to the majority of American citizens by 1965? So that's establishing, you want to have one part of your essay talk about what rights look like, democratic voting rights and political rights look like for people in 1865. And you're definitely going to want to go over the sort of the civil rights era. How does that change by 1965, right? So, um, and then it says, when did these movements succeed, and when were they defeated? So that's again establishing some part of some another part of the question that I want to see in that essay, right? Because sometimes these movements were successful and sometimes they weren't. Um, so you hear sort of the history of Reconstruction is going to be pretty important, right? Because like there is an expansion of voting rights to African American men, in the South, and you have the creation of those multiracial democracies, but only up until like 1880, 1890. And then in 1890, you have sort of the creation of Jim Crow, and you have the moving of African American men out of the political system as their voting rights are effectively taken away, right? So that's showing a failure of expanding voting rights. Whereas the civil rights movement shows a pretty sort of key success here, right? We're a multiracial democracy today, and it's because the civil rights movement creates sort of a permanent change in terms of voting rights in the country, right? So you want failures, you want successes, and you want both of those aspects in your essay, right? Um, and then and then sort of I just give you some things to kind of work with as you're work thinking through this larger question. Recount the fight for political rights. In your essay, you should discuss Reconstruction, the women's suffrage movement, and the civil rights movement. Like all of these things should be talked about in that essay. The best essays will talk about some more things beyond that, right? Uh, because you could sort of expand this prompt all the way out to populism, which is trying to build a multiracial movement to fight for economic rights. Like you could include that in this question. You could talk about the civil rights movement more broadly, right? Because you have the sort of Black freedom struggle in the South, which does successfully get the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act passed by 1965. But you have other movements at the same time, right? You have the Native American rights movement, which is focused on tribal sovereignty. You have the gay rights movement of both the 70s and the 80s and in the 2000s, right? So, because voting rights is one aspect of this question of democracy. Civil rights is another aspect of it. So you can be a little bit more expansive in your essays as well, if you wish to. But what we really should be seeing in that particular question, you should be talking about Reconstruction. You should be talking about the women's suffrage movement, and you should be talking about the civil rights movement. And those three parts of that essay should be there at a minimum, right? Um, and so then when you're thinking about sort of how to put together this essay on sort of a larger level, you have those like main three subpoints as your sort of organization, right? Then you're going to want to get into the details of each of those eras, right? So, okay, so what was Reconstruction about? Well, you should probably talk about the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th, 15th, and 13th Amendments, abolishing slavery, Equal Protection Clause, Voting Rights Act. You should probably talk about how Reconstruction was ended by sort of the presidential election of 1876, and when basically the North decided to pull back from enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments in the South, due to sort of white supremacist violence. Um, and then, do the same things with the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, right? So, talking about the Montgomery bus boycott seems pretty important here. Talking about the Birmingham campaign, talking about the March on Washington, talking about Lyndon Johnson passing the Civil Rights Act under sort of political pressure from Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists in 1964 and 1965. And then with the women's suffrage movement, the fact that it is a movement to try to get a constitutional amendment passed that's going to allow for women's suffrage. So this means going state by state by state to try to campaign for women's suffrage. And this also means that some states pass women's suffrage way earlier than others, right? And the sort of best essays will even talk about how like that's interlinked with like the populist movement, right? So there are lots of different sort of details you can get into, and because you guys have the questions in advance, this is where I wouldn't necessarily write sort of a full practice essay or something, but I would write outlines to the essays you want to do. Make sure you have those key points. Make sure you know exactly what you want to talk about, where you want to take the essay, and that you're hitting all of these sort of key aspects of them, right? And so when it comes time to the test, you can go into the final and you can almost sort of immediately start writing notes to yourself on the final exam, um, from your studies and from what you sort of remember. And so, you can write down a brief outline from memory so that you have something to go off of when putting together this larger essay, right? So that's kind of how I would tackle that that type of that type of synthesis essay. So, um, so does that help? And do you guys have any other questions on specifically sort of strategies on how to do that?
Yeah, no, that definitely that helps. So just kind of based off that too,
Yeah.
like kind of in between periods. So like for women's suffrage, like if I were to write about this one, like you think like talking about like how like World War I kind of had an impact too, like
Oh yeah.
Harry Chapman like meeting with Woodrow Wilson, everything like that. And then like even like World War II with civil rights, kind of like how like the desegregation and stuff like that would also be kind of good points like leading up into it, then talking about civil rights and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. That would actually be a great way to sort of bridge the gaps in that sort of timeline, and adding those extra details really adds a lot of breadth to your essays, right? Because if you write about it very narrowly and it just goes Reconstruction amendments, you stop writing about Reconstruction, to women's suffrage, in 1921, to we're in 1959 or 1960 civil rights movement. That would be a really sort of stilted essay, right? So adding in those sorts of gaps with your knowledge makes a lot of sense. So yeah, desegregation in World War II, absolutely. How the women's rights movement is linked into World War I, and and as exactly as you're saying, Carrie Chapman Catt meeting with Woodrow Wilson during the war. Yeah, absolutely. That's good detail that you want to sort of add in there. And even linking in some of these movements, right? Because that's the other aspect of this. Different social groups are fighting for the right to vote and fighting for political rights, but people talk to each other, right? And these movements can sometimes be a little bit integrated. So Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls, and Frederick Douglass, is a prominent abolitionist in the 1860s, 1870s, right, arguing for Reconstruction. But he was also supporting women's rights to vote in 1848, Seneca Falls. So, and similarly, you know, women suffragists were uh, lobbying Congress during the writing of the 14th and 15th Amendments to say, hey, you should include women in the right to vote as well. And their sort of concerns were dismissed at the time. And so adding those little details in is another sort of great way to sort of bridge the gaps in this much longer history. So yeah, I think that that's a great idea. And and there's, how do I say this? There are multiple right answers to this question on democracy, right? Like, as long as you are mentioning something about Reconstruction, something about women's suffrage, something about the civil rights movement, you're fine as long as you put in lots of sort of details into other parts of the essay, right? So if people really want to talk about democracy in modern America, like, a little bit more detail, right? And talking, for instance, talking about like Citizens United, talking about recent Supreme Court decisions and how they affect the Voting Rights Act. That's all fair game. Anything from the class is fair game here. If you really want to do a deep dive into Reconstruction, that's fair game, as long as you're hitting other parts of this essay and it's not solely becoming an essay on Reconstruction or solely becoming an essay on the civil rights movement. But yeah, no, I think that's a great idea to sort of add texture and create sort of more cohesive essay. So yeah, so what other questions do we have?
I have kind of like a personal question. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
So I just noticed that the exam is for our regular time in class, and I have to work like during that time. Does your course have like a makeup exam? Like I know like I'm missing another exam and they have me like coming in like Wednesday morning for it.
We'll have to figure that out. So the exam's not at 12:45, it's at 2.
Yeah,
Okay, and you're working then?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll need to figure that out. Let's see.
Because normally I would have just called off of work because it's like, I can't get around it. But I was sick last week, so I wasn't in class, and then I wasn't at work either, so I can't.
Okay. Uh, yeah. Can we talk after the review
Yeah,
session?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, let's just do that. I also don't want this conversation to be recorded and sent out to everyone else, if that makes any
It's
sense.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. So let's just talk after the review session.
All right.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so what other questions do we have? So we went over democracy question. Does anyone have a question on any of the second term essays? Happy to go over one of those. I mean, if everyone's good, I'm just fine ending it here. So whatever you guys want. I just yeah, I don't want to waste everyone's time if no one else wants to do any more review. So
I got here late. Did you go over the Bretton Woods stuff already, or
the what?
the Bretton Woods agreement stuff?
No, no, no. Yeah, we can talk about Bretton Woods agreement. Yeah, so that's an agreement that basically sets up the sort of modern financial system, international financial system after World War II. And so it's an agreement between lots of different other countries over how the financial system is going to work. It sets up the International Monetary Fund, it sets up the World Bank, it sets up sort of regular ideas of exchange rates, and it starts a process. It doesn't immediately sort of lead to free trade in the Western Hemisphere, but kind of starts a process of agreements that eventually get there effectively. Um, and so the key thing to know about Bretton Woods is it's an international financial agreement that the US, the United States, really gets involved in writing after World War II. And it really advantages the sort of US financial system, and privileges the United States, because it actually creates the dollar as the main reserve currency of the world. And if the sort of dollar is the main reserve currency, that's quite advantageous to the United States, because it means that lots of other countries start investing in the U.S. and U.S. government bonds, which effectively helps finance the U.S. government, right? And to a certain degree, the dollar is actually still the main reserve currency in the world, and so that gives a lot of financial stability to the United States, and so this kind of represents as well the US choosing to be heavily involved in international affairs after World War II and not retreating from the world at the end of that war. Because the opposite happens in World War One. You know, Woodrow Wilson tries to set up like the League of Nations, tries to keep the U.S. sort of heavily involved in international affairs, but the Senate vetoes getting involved in the League of Nations, and the U.S. kind of becomes a little bit more isolationist in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s. And so this is sort of a big change in U.S. history because basically, you can go all the way back to the American Revolution. George Washington is always like, don't get involved in world affairs, don't get involved in European affairs. And it's quite the opposite. After 1945, the United States is sort of heavily involved in what happens in the world, not only due to the Cold War, but also in terms of U.S. influence throughout the world. And so Bretton Woods kind of represents this on an economic level, effectively. Um, so, so yeah, so hope that was helpful. If so, for anyone studying for that specific part of the exam, or if you want to sort of talk about that specific question, the lecture on the post-war world is going to be very helpful to you. So, like, I'd highly recommend you go look at that, and all the details about sort of the Bretton Woods Agreement and about the U.S. getting involved in the United Nations is all in that particular lecture. And that's up on Carmen. So.
Did you have the this session last Friday? Is that on Carmen too, or?
That is not because not enough people came. People kind of trickled in. It was almost like a couple of one-on-one sessions with individuals. So I didn't feel comfortable recording it when I'm just very informally talking to people. So no, I don't have that one up. So
That's fine.
yeah, but whatever questions you have now, if we want to go over a few more other questions, I'm open to that until about 5 o'clock. So.
Can you go over this the first question on the second term essay?
Sure. Yeah. First question on the second term. All right. So that one is, oh yeah, the my transportation question. Probably too detailed for a final, but it is what it is. We're gonna go with it. Yeah. So the first question on the second term essay. So where you're gonna find this actually, and one of the reasons why I even created it was sort of a way to reward people who really focused on the sort of videos and all the materials that I put up for the class for election day when we talked about suburbanization. Um, and uh, so really I see this question as having sort of a two-part answer, right? What does transportation and living patterns in the United States look like before the 1950s and before the building of the interstate highway system and suburbanization, and what does it look like afterwards? And so, one way to study this is for this, I'd recommend there was a lecture that we did. Actually, it was you say it's a second term essay, but it was at the end of sort of uh, the end of the sort of first part. Sorry, it was one of the last lectures given before the midterms when we went over immigration and urban renewal. So there was a whole section in that lecture that we talked about for like 30 minutes about what it was like to live in a city in the United States in the 1910s, 1920s, 1900s. And so I look back at that lecture because we talked about um, effectively kind of what urban areas looked like then, how factories were like in the middle of these cities, what that looks like in terms of how people lived in sort of tenements, and then also what public transportation looks like in those cities, right? Because you had this mass railroad network that was built. And oh yeah, Jason's asking here, would redlining be something we would write about for that question? Yes, absolutely. I would heavily encourage you to write about redlining, and link that to like suburbanization and white flight, right? Because that was the other aspect of redlining. I'll talk about that in just a second. So for this earlier section, though, the way these cities looked like is you had mass railroad networks connecting cities to rural areas, and so you could just get on a train um, and use and travel across the United States on trains. That's not sort of available to us today. And then you also had public transportation networks within cities themselves. And so you had these streetcar networks, you had interurbans, and you had ways for people to get around without having a car. And so you had substantial public transportation networks and urban fabrics in the 1900s and 1910s. And there are downsides to that, right? People can get to places a lot faster with cars, but also you have more broken up communities because of that, right? And it becomes almost a requirement in many American cities to have cars in the modern age, whereas back then that wasn't the case. People could live without a car and get around the country, um, and so having a contrast between what the U.S. looked like in the 1910s and 1920s with what it looks like after the creation of the interstate highway system and after the mass production of cars and the rise of the automobile industry. I think that that is sort of an important contrast to have in this essay. And so then that also gets into these questions of redlining and of the sort of different living patterns in the United States. So before you have before suburbanization, remember when we're reading oh gosh, sorry. Why am I forgetting his name? When we were reading about immigration, and when we're reading about like a lot of these like different ethnic communities within cities and how they were all kind of like right next to each other. Um, that changes with the creation of the interstate highway system because it leads to a greater amount of housing segregation in a lot of northern cities, and that also leads to the creation of redlining, which is actually one of the reasons why you have a lot of the segregation. So redlining is the government going in and basically saying that there's certain neighborhoods that are sort of decrepit where people cannot get federal loan subsidies. And these federal loan subsidies come out of the New Deal and become a way of people having access to subsidized housing and being able to use federal government loans to afford housing. And the vehicle by which they get these subsidies is actually through the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was passed by the Roosevelt administration during World War II and after World War II by his successor Harry Truman. And it's through GI benefits that people are able to get access to federal mortgage to buy their own house, right, and to stop just renting apartments in these larger cities. Um, but these programs were administered in very sort of racist ways, where it's only usually white veterans who are able to get access to these loans. And the other aspect of this is through redlining. The only types of people who could get access to these loans are people who are already living or applying to live in white neighborhoods, for the most part. And and it just so happens that it's the areas that were redlined were African American neighborhoods. And so African American veterans couldn't get access to these loans. And this sort of starts the huge sort of racial wealth gap because it's white people who get access to these loans that are able to then get access to living into and eventually owning their house and then passing down housing to their children and then their children's children, and then that builds sort of equity through the ownerships of homes, whereas African Americans often did not have access to those same sort of financial instruments, and they had to essentially rent, which meant that you actually could not pass down wealth generation to generation, right? And so this is the sort of ways that sort of transportation and housing policy are kind of like interlinked a little bit. And so, yeah, the best answers to this question, we'll talk about those interlinkages. And then we can kind of even get into more detail about this and about how the interstate highway system is actually built often through urban neighborhoods. And so it's the interstate highway system is often built through black neighborhoods, and it actually build and it destroys a lot of wealth in black neighborhoods in the north. Um, and this is not necessarily because, how do I say this? These urban planners, when they were trying to build interstate networks, they weren't purposely building it through black neighborhoods. It's rather that white neighborhoods often had the power to resist these huge interstate highway systems from being built through their neighborhoods, whereas African American neighborhoods often did not have the same political power to do that effectively. Um, and so this also leads to sort of a period of white flight, where you have white Americans moving outside of the city, which leads to declining tax base in these cities, and leads to money going from outside the city to suburban areas. And we're kind of living um, with the consequences of this mass movement of suburbanization today, right? Um, and it's only recently that there's actually been kind of a reversal of this, with people trying to move back into the cities and actually rising rents and rising property values within side cities. And this is what people today call gentrification, money coming back into the cities, right? But this is only sort of a recent thing. And so for the most part, it is actually sort of this movement of people from outside the city into sort of the suburbs, and then people having to rely on a car to effectively get around. And this just changes the way Americans live. And then do I mention the last part of this question? I mean, so the last part of this question doesn't talk about this. But I mean, you could discuss sort of the environmental aspects of this as well, right? Because if everyone has to have a car to survive, and everyone needs a car to sort of drive in on the interstate highway system to get to their job, that leads to everyone needing to buy oil, right? And that leads to carbon emissions, which is sort of connected to modern day global warming, right? So these are all aspects that we can kind of talk about, right? Um, but the main aspects here are contrasting what do cities look like before suburbanization and what do cities look like after suburbanization. And there's a bunch of different things you can kind of talk about it within this question. And so, actually, out of all the questions, I think this is probably the most open-ended one. You can really take this question any kind of way you want, as long as you're talking about these sort of key consequences of suburbanization or urbanization. So, hope that helps. It was a little bit kind of went everywhere, but wanted to make sure to discuss all the different aspects of this question. All right. Do we have any other questions we want to go over, or any other specific questions you guys have?
Uh,
I
the
sorry. Nope. Go ahead. You're good.
okay. The environmental policies. Were there any that Nixon had, and can you talk more about that for the?
Oh, the environmental policies? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, this is where you're probably going to have a little bit of overlap between that urbanization question and the environmental question, right? Because I asked you to look at environmental policies and practices from 1945 to the present. And so when we're talking about how did American living patterns affect the environment, yeah, suburbanization matters here, right? Like this is probably something you want to mention. But the other aspect of this is talking about those key environmental policies that were passed in the 1970s. And your textbook goes over this, so definitely look back into your textbook to remind yourself about these things. But that lecture on Nixon is the one you're going to want to look at for this. So Clean Water Act, right? The Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency. These are all key aspects of environmentalism, of sort of environmental policies that were passed in the 1970s that really changed the way we live today, right? Because prior to a lot of those acts, you could have huge heavy industries right next to where people live, right? And industries could just dump massive amounts of pollutants into our water supply, right? And into the air. Um, and remember when we were talking about in the immigration lecture, I showed you that map of New York City and how like you had massive like textile factories and steel factories right next to, where hundreds of thousands of people lived in downtown Manhattan, right? And that could not have been good for people's health, right? People had to live and breathe horrific air quality, and probably, almost guaranteed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, you know, got cancer, died from cancer due to their living living right next to these huge industries, right? So that's some of these things that the the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act do. They establish regulations and say, no, industries need to be responsible for the pollutants they put into our environment. Um, and they need to in fact actually monitor and and make sure that Americans aren't poisoned by these things, right? And there are a bunch of things that sort of led to the passages of those acts. Like famously, there's sort of multiple times the Cuyahoga River caught on fire because there's so much environmental pollutants in the river that the river itself, there was like a sheen of essentially pollutants on the top of the river that was effectively flammable. And this really brought public attention to, hey, this is our drinking water. We need to get this stuff out of our environment. This is not safe. There's also actually many cases of huge sort of smogs coming down, and there are these like smog events where over the course of like 48 hours, um, people actually suffer severe health effects because they're breathing in air that's so polluted that it's causing like acute respiratory diseases, right? So this really starts to lead to Americans supporting sort of cleaning up the environment around them. And so, this essay should really talk about the Clean Air Act, should talk about the Clean Water Act, should talk about the Environmental Protection Agency, which really goes out and tries to enforce these acts, where the federal government gets involved in making sure that um, industries aren't just throwing pollutants out into the water and out into the air, right? Um, and then lastly, this essay should talk about global warming, and should talk about the the sort of key aspects of global warming, why it's a problem today, and how Americans and the federal government are attempting to address it, right? And through trying to decrease carbon emissions, trying to build wind and solar power, and if you guys want to get into the significant details of the Inflation Reduction Act, and what it does, feel free to jump into that. That would be fine. We didn't go over it in class, but it's just worth to mention that the federal government throws a lot of subsidies just recently behind the sort of creation of solar and wind and credits as well for people buying electric vehicles. I would make the argument, a lot of those subsidies should be going to e-bikes, because it's substantially better for the environment. And this other aspect that what we created from the sort of post-war period, with the creation of the interstate highway system and people driving on roads and everyone living in sort of their own sort of house, that is a much higher, how do I say this? Um, eh, that requires people to have much higher carbon emissions than it would be with people living in apartments and walking or taking public transportation. That is just a reality. Like if everyone in the world lived the way we live in the United States, there's no way you're going to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's just impossible. It is incompatible with a sort of 1.5 degree world. It's more like a 3 point degree Celsius world or 4 point degree Celsius world, which just has consequential environmental effects, right? So the way we have designed the way we live as Americans from the 50s, 60s, and 70s is incompatible with the way we're going to need to live in a world of global warming, right? So if we want to address global warming, we're gonna have to make changes into our lives. That's just sort of another thing that might be good to mention a little bit in this essay. You don't have to go into it, but I think it'd be good to. And there are actually some sort of programs today. More, this is a PSA than anything related to the test. There are actually programs today where people are actually trying to like subsidize e-bikes, and Columbus actually started a pilot program to subsidize e-bikes. And I just kind of want to show this off. I actually bought an e-bike with the Columbus subsidy program. It's actually right here. I use it to ride to campus. So look out for those programs because they can really kind of help you get around. So thank you. That's my PSA for the class. Yeah. But anyway, for the actual essay, go over those environmental legislations, talk about suburbanization, the creation of the interstate highway system, mention global warming. And mention the creation of sort of alternative energies. Those are the kind of key things you'd want to mention. You might even want to get into a little bit of the oil crisis as well, the OPEC crisis, when people actually struggled to, get gas in the 1970s. And for better or worse, the United States decided not to invest heavily in electric vehicles at the time, and now we're kind of dealing with the consequences of that in the 2010s and 2020s. So those would be the things you might want to talk about in this question. So
Thank you.
yeah, no worries. All right. So yeah, any other questions? We probably have time to kind of go over one more before we kind of conclude.
I had a really quick question. It's more general
Sure, go for
because
it.
I got some information from the last study session, but I just had a clarification.
Yeah.
On the study guide, there were several questions or several prompts for each question we will be asked on the exam.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we will be given the opportunity to answer any one of those questions, or are you going to choose one prompt from each question and give it to us on the exam?
Right. No, thanks for asking that. No, so what you got in the study guide is what's going to be on the exam. You will have a full choice between everything on that study guide.
Okay.
So, and that's why I'm going to expect it to be a little bit longer, right? You guys have a little bit more time to prepare. For those of you who are listening to this recording tonight, you have all the information here, right? So, so you can really dig in and write a really good essay on both those first and second essays. So choose which one you want to focus on, and go ahead and start outlining. That's what I encourage you guys to do.
Yeah, fair game. I just wanted to check that. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Thanks for asking that. That's an important clarification. So great. Yeah. So yeah, any other content questions? Again, I got 15 minutes, so you know, if you want more information, that's fine. If you feel pretty good, then I'm fine in it here too.
Yeah, I kind of just have a really quick question, based off of the environment question. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about Henson's address to Congress in 1988? Just
Yeah.
yeah, because that's something I want to include in like the global warming talk and stuff like that. So I just want to make sure I had a little more information on that.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a really detailed question, so I'll do my best. So yeah, so I mean the key thing to note about that Hansen talk, and it's interesting because at the time it did not get much press. It's only recently that we've kind of looked back at at um at at sort of the response of the United States to global warming that that Americans have kind of, or historians have looked back and said, oh, that was actually a pretty important event, because this is the event where it really becomes public knowledge that global warming is a problem and that the United States should do something to address it. Because Hansen basically goes to Congress, and Hansen shows kind of reports to Congress that global warming is a thing, that the sort of the patterns of global of the patterns of global warming are noticed by scientists, that scientists have done research and they've noticed that there has been more carbon in the atmosphere, and that's leading to a greenhouse gas effect. And specifically, what Hansen talks about with this greenhouse gas effect is that the more carbon you have as in the atmosphere, the more it leads to when sort of the rays of the sun come down through the atmosphere, the atmosphere traps in more heat. And because of that, that leads to the Earth slowly warming up. I say slowly warming up, slowly in terms of humans, right? So in 1998, I mean, I think we're at what, 0.5 degrees of centigrade warming. It was a pretty small amount. But as more and more carbon gets trapped in the atmosphere, that actually leads to pretty substantial rapid warming from geological times. And Hansen sort of notes that this is not this in 1988. Scientists have found out that this is not just a natural cycle of warming, that this is in fact humans causing the earth to warm up in a much more dramatic fashion. And Hansen basically makes the argument, you know, the US should probably do something to address this. We need to decrease the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And what are our main sources of carbon that are going into the atmosphere in the 1980s and to today? Well, it is emissions from automobiles, right? Because we're burning gas, we're burning gasoline. That's leading carbon to go up into the atmosphere. It is coal, and coal power, especially in the 1980s, was pretty big. Eventually, it's been replaced by other forms of energy. For the most part, it's like natural gas, which is a little bit more clean burning, still a substantial emissions, but not as bad as coal. Um, and then it's other sources of emissions as well, like methane. And methane in particular is a very potent greenhouse gas that actually increases warming on a much greater scale. The irony about methane, though, is once it's out of the atmosphere, it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long. So once you kind of stop methane emissions, you will see sort of not as much substantial warming. And methane emissions are actually caused both by fracking of natural gas. You have a bunch of methane leaks from that. And then actually this is where diets come in, really by cows, actually, by the cattle industry, because we, uh, Americans eat lots and lots of beef, actually. And so cows and ranching actually increases methane emissions, weirdly. And so, anyway, longest getting back to Hansen, this is kind of the first time that the U.S. is heavily informed, and there's really no excuses for the U.S. government and the American public not to understand what global warming is. The United States basically chooses not to really address it at the time. There are no actions taken to address global warming. The Kyoto Protocols are established in 1977. The U.S. is considering signing on to this. Actually, President Clinton at the time wants to sign on to it. George W. Bush takes office. A Republican Senate takes office in 2000. The Senate vetoes signing the Kyoto Protocols. So there's no attempt for the United States to be involved in trying to address global warming really until the Obama administration in 2008. And by that time, global warming has become a much larger issue because there's been no attempt for the most part by the international community to address it without the U.S. being involved, right? And remember, we talked about in our economic sort of section in class, oil companies are the wealthiest companies in the early 2000s, right? So the oil industry doesn't want global warming to be addressed, and so they throw lots of lobbying money into the Senate to try to prevent people from addressing global warming. And so that's led to consequences today. That is why we are facing now a 1.5 degree world, and really probably more like a 2 degree world. It's very doubtful we're gonna even hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means, much sort of worse consequences for the world and environmental consequences that we're gonna have to live with. So historians have kind of looked at that Hansen um, that um, that Hansen addressed to Congress as sort of a big what if. What if we had taken global warming very seriously in 1988, tried to do something to address it, right? And what if the United States had gone to the world and been like, let's try to lower emissions? It didn't end up happening that way. And so, now we are facing a sort of a much, much worse problem. I will say I don't want to be all doom and gloom. One sort of advantage that we have today that we didn't have in 1988 is alternative energies are significantly cheaper now. So solar and wind solar is actually the cheapest form of energy now. And so that means that private companies are much more willing to build alternative energies today. And that was not the case in the 1980s. In the 1980s, coal by far was the cheapest form of energy. And gasoline by far was the cheapest form of energy. But nowadays, having an electric car, having an electric bike, charging it with a electric network that is primarily solar or wind is going to be actually as cheap as coal, or as cheap as gasoline, sometimes even cheaper, which is, that's a huge, huge, huge success. And so it's going to make it a lot easier to address global warming, but because it's taken so long to do so, we're going to have to make a lot more rapid emissions cuts. So sorry, I got a lot more into sort of contemporary stuff. But anyway, yeah, but that's where I'd fit in Hansen in terms of the context of that, as this moment when global warming could have been more directly addressed, and it's unfortunately not. So
Thank you for the help.
yeah, no worries. Thanks for listening to my spiel on this. Anyway, all right. Any other questions we have? Right. Well, if not, we went over a few of the short essays. We went over the democracy question fairly detailedly. So yeah, so hopefully that helps you out. And yeah, and I guess we can kind of conclude here, unless there's any last questions. All right, great. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow for the final. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me. And I'll go ahead and stop recording. And yeah, thank you very much.